Thank you for joining me today for a walk in my garden. I'm Liz Davey, and you're watching A Walk in the Garden on Norfolk Community Cable Television, NCTV. We're starting, as we usually do, in my herb garden. We meet here about twice a month and follow the garden through the season. I visit all the gardens in my property, which include an herb garden, perennials, vegetables, and a shade garden, and even a small water garden. Today, again, we're starting in the herb garden. Spring has come. It's the end of April, almost into May, and April and May are probably the busiest times in the yard and garden for getting things done. Hopefully you've gotten most of your beds cleaned out by now because things are springing up with the warm weather. In the herb garden, right now I have a rose right here, and it needs to be pruned a bit. This is a apothecary rose, which is why it's in the rose garden rather than the perennial garden. It's an old-fashioned rose that needs to be pruned very little as time goes by, but I'll take off. In pruning roses, there are 3 Ds that you start with: dead wood, diseased wood, and damaged wood. And once you get those off, then you just prune for aesthetics and size. If it's too big, you might want to head it back a little bit to an outward facing bud on the rose. I'll remove any of these pieces that I cut off. And then it's time to add some fertilizer. And I like an organic fertilizer. And this is an organic rose fertilizer. And I'll use this about 3 times during the season. Once right now as the foliage starts to appear on the plant, and I'm putting it around the outside of the plant, which is called the drip line. And I will dig some of that in, just out on the drip line. We had some rain, so the soil is kind of moist. And we'll just dig it in a little bit. And if it were dry, I would definitely water this in. And the next time I add fertilizer will be after the bloom cycle has completed. This is especially important if you have a reblooming rose. This is an old rose that is only 1 bloom per year in June, and then it's done for the year. But I will fertilize it anyway to give it the strength for next year. With a reblooming rose, the fertilizer will help you get that second flush of bloom on the rose. I notice in here that some of my lemon balm has run away from home. So I'm going to take that out and pot it up. I'm busy right now getting some plants ready, potted, herbs and perennials, shade plants for the Garden Club's annual plant sale. And lemon balm is a nice plant to have, but it does tend to spread a little bit here and there. And that gives an opportunity to share a few of the plants with someone else. So we'll just add that to my collection that I'm saving for the plant sale. There are other pieces in here that I can dig. Anything that has gotten a little too large. I have some tansy down here that can be divided. Tansy is a good thing to put out. It looks nice in a floral arrangement, and it does help keep some of the bugs away. And I definitely have garlic chives and probably quite a bit of oregano that I can help divide and have in the herb section of the plant sale. You could also divide and share with friends and family if they'd like to start a little herb garden. Again, for the rest of the herb garden, I've used just a general purpose garden fertilizer, but I only use the specific ones on the roses. There are several things that are now ready to pick and use in the garden, and one of those is chives. Chives are really easy to harvest. With a pair of scissors, you just cut a bunch down near the ground. And that's all there is to it. And they're ready to use. We can also pick sorrel. Sorrel this is French sorrel. It is a an herb that is more popular in Europe than in this country. It is related to the sorrel, that is a weed that you find in your grass with a little yellow blossom. However, this has been cultivated for many years in France and in other European countries, and even here. It's a very sour taste. It's a lemony taste, and we can use that in the kitchen right now. It's best when the leaves are quite young. You can use it when they're a little older. It's much too sour to use alone as a salad herb, but added to salads just a little adds a little tang, and it can be used in soups and sauces to add a little lemon flavor. It's a nice herb to have. It's an attractive herb, and it'll just kind of keep growing here all summer, so I can keep picking it. It's time to put up the birdhouses. I've got one up here, a wren house. I just heard a wren as we came out to do the show. The wrens are back. They usually come back about the first week in May. This is a week before that, so they're a little early this year. We've had some warm weather. And I heard one wren. I'll probably be hearing wrens every morning now, waking up to them. But if you've taken your birdhouses in for winter, make sure they're cleaned out and hang them up, and you'll probably have birds before you know it. Now let's head on over to the perennial garden and do some work there. I'm in the perennial garden now, and things are starting to bloom. We have a lot more color than we had here 2 weeks ago. PJM rhododendrons are in bloom. I have this one that's the lavender. I also have several pink ones. The pink ones are a little later blooming than this lavender one. One of the things I need to do right now is prune the roses, or not the roses, the grapes. And this is a grape arbor. And again, you follow the same pruning principles: dead, diseased, or damaged, and then cut them back to a strong bud. And the more you cut a rose, it seems like the more it will bloom. And I won't do the whole thing right now, but I will take off some of the long pieces, and we'll pick those up later. And then I'll come out and tie them up. I don't really get any grapes from these, maybe a handful occasionally, but I don't grow them. Mainly I grow them to have some nice leaves that cover this grape arbor. And if we happen to get a handful of grapes, that's just a bonus. This looks rather diseased, so I'm going to cut it all the way back. And again, you go for those things first, anything that's spindly. This is pretty spindly, so it'll come back too. Seems like the more you prune, the more they grow, so they should be okay. Usually the birds are the recipient of the grapes, and that's all right because the birds are also doing a nice job eating things in the garden. Again, I'll come out here next and tie these up as they start to grow so that they kind of cover the arbor. I'm going to fertilize the grapes with just a couple handfuls of all-purpose fertilizer. And this is also what I would use on my bulbs. If I didn't fertilize them when they first came up, which is a good idea, I can give them a light fertilizing now. Again, some of the daffodils have already gone by. And the foliage that you see on the spring bulbs now, the daffodils and the hyacinths and the tulips, all of that foliage is going to continue to grow for a while before it browns off. And that's what's going to feed the bulb that's underneath so that you will have a nice bloom next year. What you need to do once the plant is finished blooming is cut off the top. This is where it would go to seed. And I would like to strengthen the bulb rather than have them go to seed. If they were out in a meadow, I might leave them and let them go to seed, and we'd have more daffodils in, maybe 10 years. But I want these to be neater and also to strengthen the bulb instead of using the energy to make seed. And it does make it a little neater as the plants go. Some of the tulips are already in bloom. I'm out here with my deer spray. Deer love tulips. They, I think, are the deer's favorite dessert. And if you don't use deer spray regularly on them, you will not have tulips if you live in Norfolk. Almost guaranteed, unless you have a dog in the garden to protect them. Some of the bulbs this year did what we call blasting, and that means they didn't bloom. We had a late freeze after some very early warm weather. So if your daffodils look like this, there's a bud, but the bud just turned brown and died. It hit some of the daffodils and not others. It depends kind of on the location and where the frost came through, but it's nothing wrong with the plant. It's the weather that did it. So don't worry that you've got a disease on the daffodils. They will probably be fine another year, again, depending on the weather. But it's something that happens. It's called blasting. And they started too early and were frozen. I use either purchased plant supports, or sometimes I use the tomato cages that I've cut into pieces. These work really well to support a plant. I know this plant is going to get about 18 inches tall, and it tends to be kind of sprawly and get run over by the lawnmower if it sticks out too far. So I've added a support to that. I've added a taller one to this poppy, which will have some large pink heavy blooms, we hope, in another couple weeks or a month. So that will need some support as well. I like the tomato cage once they disappear kind of into the foliage. They're not real bright and jarring. You won't even see them later on. I do have some purchased larger supports that I'll add to things like the grass that I cut down. This tends to get very large, and a grow-through support here works really well to control it and keep it from flopping on the ground when it rains. Other things are coming up. Daylilies, hydrangeas, again more bulbs, another tulip or another rose, and again I can work on that. This is a diseased part that needs to come off, and it needs to come off right away. And there's another spot that's even a larger piece that is diseased and needs to come off. It's not going to do anything this year, so we'll just get rid of it. And right there as well. Again, we'll fertilize that with the rose fertilizer. Another rose back here. And there's also a clematis growing on this one. And I can use the rose fertilizer on both of them. I've already pruned this climbing rose, and it's responding with a lot of new growth. So we'll put this around the edge. And I'll dig that in. Again, I use the rose tone on this one, and it's good for clematis as well. Rose tone is good on things that need a little more fertilization. I can also use it on my poppies, and I have a tree, or peonies, and I have a tree peony right here which I've already fertilized with the rose tone. Hydrangeas are another thing. This is a hydrangea which needs to be cut back. These are not going to grow. It's coming up from the base. I did surround this with leaves last winter in hopes that it would keep some of the leaves on the stalks. It did not. It comes up from the base each year. I probably will relocate this plant into a location that might be a little gentler for it. With hydrangeas, you really need to add something if you want blue hydrangeas. A product called soil acidifier. They really like acid soil, which allows them to take up aluminum, and that allows them to form the blue flowers. So we put a product that acidifies them, and sometimes even aluminum sulfate is used to get the blue color of the hydrangea. Now I can also use Holly-tone on hydrangeas, and Holly-tone is designed for things that really like acid. It's a fertilizer, but it's for those plants which like an acid soil. A pH that would be down around 5 or 6 rather than around 7, which would be neutral. If I had a plant that wanted to have alkaline soil or a pH above 7, I would need to add lime. But I'll add some of the Holly-tone here. And again, we'll work that in around the plant. I'll do this with all the hydrangeas and also blueberries, which like it very acid, and rhubarb. I won't add the soil acidifier that promotes blue, but I will use Holly-tone as the fertilizer. The soil here tends to be rather acid anyway, and that's why there are so many blue hydrangeas down at the Cape. I have some lilies in this garden. I believe they're over here, and they may be hard to see from your angle, but it's time to start looking at the lilies and examining them for the red lily beetles. The red lily beetle is an introduced species. It came from in on a boat and has traveled around the East Coast, and they're little red, bright red beetles that completely destroy Asiatic and other lilies. They don't bother daylilies, so you don't have to worry about your daylilies. But if you do have the trumpet lilies, you have to be careful and find them. You can use a pesticide. I prefer not to do it because it also is very deadly to the bees, and I like to have bees in my garden. So I just go over them, and if I find them, I squash them. That's the easiest way. I've been doing that for the last probably 10 years that they've been here, 8 to 10 years that they've been around. They have introduced some sort of predator insect down in Rhode Island. I think it may have helped, or else my coming out and squashing all the ones I find has helped. But I have to keep checking the lilies probably a couple times a week. Otherwise you can come out and all the foliage on the lily will be completely gone. So if you see holes in your lily foliage, start looking for those red beetles. They're quick. You have to be quick to catch them, but they're worth destroying. If you don't like squashing them, you can put them into a can of soapy water and get rid of them that way. But I just usually try to catch them and squash them. I like lilies enough to put in the extra effort to do them. About this time, when all the bulbs are in bloom, I like to get out my camera and take a picture here and there in the bulb garden and try to include something that is a point of reference, like a fence post or perhaps another plant that will be permanent. That way, in the fall, when I'm standing here with a bag of bulbs, I'll have some idea where the other bulbs are. By fall, all of the bulb foliage is gone, and you have no idea where to put the new bulbs. So there are several ways you can mark it. You can write it down in a notebook. I tend to write it down after I've taken the picture. But a picture kind of helps you locate where they were, and you can put in new ones. Some people put in golf tees. I'm going to be mulching this bed, so that's not going to help. I would cover up the golf tees, but a golf tee will also help mark a spot where you need a bunch of bulbs. Now it's time to go into the vegetable garden. I'll see you there. I've set up some rows in the vegetable garden, and I'm going to skip a row. The things we planted 2 weeks ago have germinated. We have lettuce and chard and some kale and also some onions that have started to come up. We can use some of those for green onions. I also planted some kale plants, lanceolato kale, that I happened to see at the garden center. And the peas have started to break ground, so they'll be coming up soon, and I'll need to get some pea fence up. So I already have planted 3 rows, and I had the row of garlic. And now it's time, I'm going to leave a row and plant some flowers here later on. It's a little too early to plant some of the more tender flowers. So I'll leave a row, and I'm going to plant today carrots and beets. And I've used my hoe, and I used the handle of the hoe to make a nice little furrow. Not too deep, because the seeds that I'm planting are pretty small. And work to get some of the rocks out. We do have rocky New England soil. And then I'm going to spread the carrots. Now carrots are tiny little seeds, so you have to spread them quite thinly if you don't want a big job of thinning them out later. You'll still have to thin them some, but the idea is not to spread them too thickly in the beginning. Some people plant radishes with the carrots to mark them, and then because carrots are going to be quite slow to germinate. Radishes come up quite quickly, so they can mark a row if you wish to do it that way. By planting in straight rows, I can kind of tell where things are, so I don't usually do that. I've put a stake in. This is how many carrots I want to plant at this time. I'll plant some more carrots later for a later crop. And I'm going to just gently cover these and pat down the soil. Because it's a tiny seed, you really don't need much covering over them. Soil is nice and moist. We've been getting some regular rain. So with the soil moist, these should germinate well, though it will take some time. The next thing I want to plant are beets. And I have 2 kinds of beets. This is called 3-root Grex. And Grex kind of refers to a mixture that isn't too stable. In other words, you'll get some pink ones, some red ones, and some golden ones in this mix. These seeds are a little bit larger, and they're kind of crinkly. But again, we don't want them too close together, because often you'll get more than one seedling from one seed. The nice thing about beets is that anything you thin out, you can use the tops as beet greens for soup or just for greens, sauteed with a little garlic, little olive oil. And again, we can keep planting beets on into fall. We'll get a few reds, again, a few pinks, and a few golds. But we really like the golden beets. So, the third one I'm going to plant are golden beets. Second beet, third crop. And these are our golden beets. Very difficult, if not impossible, to find in the grocery. Farmers markets may have them. But they're very mild with yellow to orange flesh. One of my favorite beets because they are mild and very attractive. And people who don't like beets even like these when they've been roasted. In the next few weeks, I'll be planting more lettuce, a lot of different varieties of lettuce. I always go overboard on lettuce because I'm so hungry for fresh lettuce when it comes time to order seeds. But I'll plant quite a few varieties of lettuce, Swiss chard, perpetual spinach, which is a type of chard that is more like a spinach than a chard. We did plant spinach over in this garden and it is coming up, but if we get really, really hot weather in May, it may not do too well. Spinach is a cool season crop. I will plant more spinach in the fall, in actually mid to late summer as a fall crop so that it can mature when the temperatures get cooler this fall. So I'll just keep planting. And the important thing is to keep writing it down. That way I'll know I left this row for flowers and I can write in what I did plant in this bed. And I'll know that I planted carrots, three-root Grex beet, and golden beet. And I have part of a row left for some more lettuce later on. Planting a little at a time will give you a crop that lasts through the summer, and hopefully you can keep planting and harvesting some of these things for a long time. These are the milk cartons that we started inside in the spring. And this is some of the kale that's coming up. I've opened these up now that the weather's a little warmer. If it really got cool, I could come out and close them up again. But so far it's been all right. They also needed to be watered, so having them out for the rain was really nice. This is flower. Not all of them germinated, but quite a few did. And we have cabbage and kale that actually can be set into the garden rather quick soon. This is a few Brussels sprouts that can go out. I also started some of those in the house and have moved them out to the garden shed. Blueberries. I've got a couple blueberry bushes. I haven't been really successful with these, but I'm hoping this year will be a change. I'm going to use the Hollytone fertilizer on these. They do like quite a bit of fertilizer. And they like it very acid. And then I'll mulch them with some peat moss that I happen to have. Peat moss is one of those things that they're encouraging you not to use too much of, but if you have it, you might as well use it until it's gone. And this needs to be wet, and I will wet that with the hose after I've put it on. But by mulching with the peat moss, you're giving it a nice acid mulch. You could also use sawdust or pine needles. They're also acid, and they will help with the blueberries. Another hungry plant is rhubarb, and that's a fruit too. And again, we'll keep that well fertilized. This is one that I put in as a start from a friend last year, and it's doing really well. I should be able to harvest a few stalks. I also have a plant in the herb garden and a few in the flower garden because I happen to like its large leaves. I think they look really attractive and ornamental as well as being useful to eat. But again, it's a fairly hungry plant. Once the peas are fully up, I'll probably top dress those a little bit as we go. And again, another thing that we can pick is a plant called lovage. Those of you who have watched my shows before know that I have several lovage plants. Lovage is a very old-fashioned plant. It's a hollow-stemmed plant, and it's a relative, as you might guess, of parsley and celery. It has hollow stems. It is very, very strong celery flavor. It dries extremely well, and I've picked some that I'll show you how I'm going to dry it. It's wonderful in Thanksgiving bread stuffing or any type of stuffing. It can be used in potato salad, but you just use a small amount because it is quite a strong celery flavor. Lovage is a fine old plant. You can find it in very old recipe books. I'm talking 1800s, early 1900s. It was a plant that they grew on the farms back then. They didn't have celery at the supermarket, so they had to come up with something that would add flavor to their food. And lovage is one of those things. It kind of went out of favor, but I think it's coming back a little bit for some of the organic gardeners who have discovered it. Now I'm going to go over to the potting bench and do a little work there. I've moved most of my planting outside now that the weather's pretty good. I've put my potting soil into a garbage can next to an old bench, and I've moved some plants outside. This is a rosemary. Rosemary is hardy down to about 20 degrees, and I don't think we're going to have any weather that's 20 degrees or less. And I'll move this out here on the bench for a while. It's a little shady right here. I'll keep it watered, and then I can move it to the herb garden and plant it. I dug this plant up last fall and moved it into my front entry, which is just a cool, unheated entry that gets a little heat from the house. It never really goes below freezing, but it stays pretty cool. And it managed to live, and we'll try to keep it alive for another month. Then I can be sure that we won't have a frost, and I can put it into the garden. It's also acclimating to a little more sun as it sits out here. Also inside, I dug begonias, and I put those in my cool back bedroom on a bed of peat moss. And there they sat all winter. Well, now they have some sprouts. So it's time to put them into some flower pots and actually plant them. And I have 2 pots here, approximately the size, and I filled them with quite a bit of soil. And whether I leave them in the pots, I don't know what I'm going to do with them. I may leave them in the pots or not. And I can add some of the potting soil on top. And then I'll water them. And again, I'll probably leave them out here for the time being, unless it gets really cold. These are a little more sensitive to temperature. The next few days are supposed to be warm, but if I see in the forecast that it's going to get down into the 40s at night, I'll probably bring them in the house. It's one of those iffy seasons. But we'll just actually let these little sprouts stay on top and fill in around them. Maybe put a little of the peat on top. The harvesting of peat is not particularly ecologically sound, which is why it's discouraged. However, I happen to have a bag and I need to use it up. I won't be buying any more for that reason. And then I can water those. And the rosemary. And I'm digging a lot of plants again for a plant sale and to share with friends. And I always keep some of these craft sticks available and a Sharpie, and I write on them what it is. I know the begonias. I probably won't do that. I know they're white begonias. If I had different colors, I would definitely mark them as to what they were. I also know what the rosemary is, so no need to mark that one either. When I pot up the plants, I like to put a piece of newspaper in the bottom. Just a small piece is sufficient. Doesn't even need to be this big. To cover up the holes. The water can drain through, but the dirt can't. And if you're giving it to somebody to share, you really don't want it to get all over their house or car in the process. So having a little piece of newspaper in there is helpful. Then I'll put in some soil and then the plant. And then we will head off to the backyard and see what we can find back there. Plenty to do in all areas of the garden in this season. I like sweet alyssum, and you can buy it in the garden center, but it also grows really well from seed. And I've got the window boxes here, and I'm just going to sprinkle a few alyssum seeds around the pansies that I put in here. And I will be adding some other annuals to the window box, but it's nice to have the white, low flowering plant that will flower pretty much all summer if I keep it trimmed back a little. And these seeds will grow. I'll just kind of pat them down, and given some water and sun, they will probably come up and add a nice white texture to the window boxes along the way. Now let's go back and see what's in the back garden and the pond. Large plants, large planters are sometimes expensive to fill with annuals, and I've filled this with annuals or cuttings every year. I've decided to try a few perennials in here. If you put perennials in a planter that stays out all winter, you want to make sure that it's at least 2 zones hardier than your current zone. Our current zone is a 5 to 6, so I would like to choose plants that are hardy in zones 3 or 4. Probably 3 would be more likely. I started this because I inadvertently put a piece of a hosta in this pot a few years ago. It was a temporary solution. I dug it up and I needed a place to put it. Well, I forgot about it. And lo and behold, it's come up the last 2 years. And I said, maybe I can put more perennials in here. So I've put a little start last year of Brunera, which is one of the plants I'll be showing you later, and one of the carex, the hardy for shade grasses. And they've grown well. Well, I was gifted with this lovely variety of grape hyacinth. They seem to be a little taller. And I thought, well, I have a lot of grape hyacinth in the garden. Maybe I should try this in the planter. So that's what I'm going to do. It's got nice roots, very nice roots. So I'll just dig a hole in the planter and pop it in there. These will, in time, the foliage will ripen. They won't last all summer, but they give it a little color now. And I will be filling in with other things, so it's nice to have something in the pot at this time. And I think I will keep adding some other things and do a little experiment. If I'm dividing my own stock, I really am not spending much money on it, and it's a good experiment to see what will grow. You can look up in plant catalogs and they will give you the zone. These are USDA, Department of Agriculture hardiness zones. Again, we used to be zone 5. Now we are, I believe it's zone 6B. They get, the numbers get higher as you move south. But they've decided that things are warmer here than they used to be. So we have gone to a 6. However, to be perfectly safe, if you have a cooler location, a zone 5 will work quite well. But it's fun to experiment sometimes when you're doing a planter and see what you can do. Moving down the way, Brunera has a nice little forget-me-not-like flower. The flowers themselves don't last. It blooms just once a season, but the leaves continue to enlarge and it has quite attractive foliage for the rest of the season, rather than having the foliage die back. It looks very nice with spring bulbs. I have a variety of ground covers and plants in this garden. The hosta are starting to come up. The hellebores are still blooming. Remember, they started back in March and they're still going strong. In fact, last year they reseeded. They reseed every year. And I'm going to dig some of these up and pot them up for sharing. And again, I will just come back here with some compost after I dig them up, but I'll put them into the pots along with some potting soil, and they'll be ready to share. There are a number of them in here, and there are also some small ones which I'll let grow another year. They need 2 or 3 years before they reach blooming size. This would be probably a 2-year seedling, so it needs maybe another year or so, depending on where it's put. These like a part shade area, part shade to full shade, and they seem very happy for me here. They vary in color. Some are quite dark, some are quite light. You can buy all kinds of fancy cultivars. This is just kind of the standard hellebore, and it's quite hardy. I may try one of those in my pot. Some of the other plants that are in bloom, the hostas are starting to arise, and they're coming up in little spikes. Bleeding heart is starting to bloom. Again, this plant will get somewhat larger. Epimedium is a nice little ground cover. It's some of them are blooming, some of them are almost out of bloom. They're often called fairy bells because they have these tiny little white or pink or purple or orange blooms. Some of them are even red. Here's another one that has dark leaves. It hasn't bloomed yet. We'll see that one in another couple weeks. Behind them are dogtooth violets, and that's a New England native. Unfortunately, the deer like them, which is why they are probably not as prevalent as they once were. And these are a bulb. You can plant the bulb in the fall and have the dogtooth violets in the spring. It is more, not really a violet, it's more of a lily. It's a little small lily. And I think they're very attractive. And they look very nice also with the epimedium foliage, which is heart-shaped. They have their own foliage, which is more of a long leaf. These are bloodroot, and again, a native plant. This one happens to be a double, which is a cultivated cultivar of the native. I also have the native, which has gone by so far. And also, this one is a native, the bleeding heart, the large bleeding heart. There are smaller bleeding hearts that will grow in a little more sun. Those are lower, and they are not the native version. They're a more nursery type plant, but they will grow and come back. And I used to have a few of those, and probably they don't seem quite as hardy as the native one. This one will reseed in places. I don't see any seedlings here, but this came from another plant that I have. I found a seedling next to it and planted it here. So you can, once you get something in the garden, you can plant it all over and move it around and share it. A lot of the ferns are starting to come up in this area too. I'm going to move back to this area. The clue to having hosta, at least in my area where there are deer, deer love hosta as much as they love tulips. And I like hosta too, and I grow quite a bit of it. And I found the clue for hosta is to start early. This enough, but I want to use my deer spray on the little spikes that are coming up out of the ground, all around it, and just keep at it. Again, I use this pump sprayer, which tends to work pretty dependably with the deer spray. Whatever brand you use, the important part is to use it, and to use it often. Deer like hosta, and if you like hosta and want to grow them, then you need to do some things. Deer spray, and also slugs like hosta. And if you have a little damp area like I have here with some leaf litter on the ground, you're going to have some slugs. They're those slimy things that are like the inside of snails. But they do come out at night and they will eat your hosta leaves. And once the hosta leaf has a big hole in it, the hole is there forever, and it just gets bigger with the leaf. So you'd like to help them not do that. So I use a product, it's called Sluggo. I think there are various names. It kills snails and slugs, but it isn't a real poison. It's an iron phosphate product. Obviously, you don't want your children or pets to eat it, but there are slug baits that used to be used that were extremely toxic and would kill pets and children. So those are not the ones. This is an iron product. You need iron in the soil anyway, and it will dissolve into the iron that is useful for the plants. But it does repel the slugs. They have a magnetic charge, and I guess the iron works with that charge on the slug's slimy little body. And some people put diatomaceous earth, not the kind you use in your pool, but a garden type, on their hosta. Other people put out dishes of beer, which attract the slugs, and then you have to get rid of the slugs. I prefer this stuff. You don't have to touch them. And it works pretty well as long as you get out there and make sure there's some around each of your hosta that is in a wooded area. I keep those two things going, and hopefully we'll enjoy some hosta this year, and it will fill in this garden, and it really looks nice and cool in the summer, along with the ferns, the ginger, and some of the spring things. I have a ground phlox, or creeping phlox here, a woodland phlox. There are several types of early spring phlox. One of them requires full sun. This is a woodland phlox that will be bright pink in a few weeks, and it likes shade. I have a blue version on the other side. This is Mertensia, which is a native plant, and the deer like this one too, somewhat. Not a lot, but they will eat it. So I have sprayed it, and it has these lovely blue flowers in the spring, and it is spreading. I started with one plant. Now I have 4 or 5, and I'm hoping it just moves right on down this little hill for the future. Again, it looks nice with some daffodils. I also have things to do inside my little greenhouse. These are the seedlings I grew inside, and they're growing out of their little cells. Their roots are coming right on out, and they need to be repotted. It's not quite time to put them into the garden, so I will use some potting soil, and I've mixed this with some compost. It's quite moist, and these are peppers, hot peppers in fact, and I'll put those in the pot, and since there were some roots a little higher on the stem, I'll make sure I cover those roots as I put it in the pot. I'll continue doing that with all of the seedlings in this pot. I'll then put them into a container that will hold a little water so that when I water them, I'm not watering the floor. And I'll keep them watered, and I'll keep them in here. It tends to be warmer in here. I have maximum minimum thermometer on the wall. It hasn't gone below 40 for quite a while. It's gone up to over 100, however, on a sunny day. So I have to make sure I get out here and open the door and window if it gets really hot, or these things will actually burn. But as long as I keep the window and door open, they are very happy in the nice warm environment. These are the Brussels sprouts that I started inside, and they too should probably have been transplanted. I didn't get it done, but I will be actually hardening these off by setting them outside in the shade and then moving them into the garden very soon, so they can go right into the garden, as can the little cabbages that we planted outside. Very soon they can go into the garden as well, because they are hardier crops that will take a little cool weather. Tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, they don't want the cool weather. Don't bother planting those until probably mid to end of May at the earliest. They really like a warm soil, and it isn't there yet. It's on its way, but it's not time to plant them yet. Now let's head back towards the house. Here we are in the kitchen, and we're going to make a meal using some things that are in season and also some of the things from the garden. And I'm going to start out by putting some things in the oven. And the first will be a pear, and this is going to be our dessert. And I use a melon baller, which is a handy little tool to have, to remove the core. And then I'll probably want to remove the stem too. These are Bartlett pears, and they seem to be on sale, so they're in season. Or they are storage pears, very likely the latter. But they seem to be plentiful right now, so I thought I would make something with them. And I'll cut out the core end too, the stem end. And I'm going to put those into a small dish. And again, use my melon baller to take out the core part. There's a little extra here. It needs to come out. Brown. I've washed the pear before we started. Take out these pieces. Anything else we don't want in here? There's a bit of brown on it that I will remove. Yeah. And I'll put that in the little dish. And I'm going to put some brown sugar in each one. And a little butter. And then some kind of spice. And we like Chinese 5-spice. But you could also use cinnamon or nutmeg or ginger, whatever you would like to use in them. And then I'll add a little splash of wine, just a bit, to give it some moisture. And these go in the oven. At the same time I put these in the oven, I'll put in some asparagus, which has been drizzled with olive oil and sprinkled with a little all-purpose seasoning. We use the salt-free Mrs. Dash seasoning. And I'm going to stick those in a 350 oven. And they'll be out in about half an hour. The pears are really good with some ice cream. You want to cook them until they're completely down. The next thing I'm going to do is a salmon dish. And this is going to be salmon with a sorrel sauce. And I've used shallots, which I grew last year and will plant again. Probably at the end of the row we planted today. I bought some shallots for planting. These are shallots for eating. They are different because these have probably been treated with something so that they won't sprout. And these are from Holland. But I had some I grew last year, and that's what I used, chopped up in this area. And I added a little broth. They said you could use fish stock. I didn't have any, so I used vegetable broth. And I just sauteed them down. And then I added some wine, and we're cooking that down a little more. And once that is cooked down, until it's rather syrupy, and it's getting there, I think, very quickly, I'll add creme fraiche, about 5 tablespoons. I'm just making a small amount. And this I made by adding buttermilk to heavy cream and letting it stand at about 70 degrees for about 8 to 10 hours. And what it does is it makes a thick, sweeter sour cream. You could use sour cream instead. And we're going to cook this for a few minutes until it thickens up a bit. And you remember the sorrel that we picked? I took out the stem in the middle and cut it into pieces. This is about a cup of sorrel. Sorrel sauce is often used in sauces and soups. Again, it's much too acidic for just eating on its own. It's very lemony. A leaf of it can be used in a sandwich or a little bit in a salad, but to make a whole salad out of it, it would be just too much. But it is good as a lemony accent, and especially with fish or chicken. Now that it's thickened up a little, I'm going to add the sorrel and cook it just a few minutes. And then I'll add a little butter, just a piece at a time. Get it out of here. And turn it down to low until that's melted. You want to cook the sorrel but not overcook it. It's a rich sauce. I'm going to pour that into my serving pan. And the salmon has been pre-cooked. The original recipe suggested cooking it, just sautéing it in a pan until it was completely cooked. I cooked it in the oven. I find cooking salmon or most fish in the oven, in a hot oven, is probably a little easier. And that's what we have. It's a salmon dish. To serve with it, I wanted to use some chives because they're in season too. And so I've boiled some new potatoes again, and I'll just put a little butter on them and then sprinkle them with chives. Chives are good on most vegetables. They have the slight onion flavor. The shallots that I used in the salmon dish have a different flavor. They're all in the same family. Onions, chives, shallots, they're alliums. And there are even some decorative ones that we don't eat. But they're very good accent with many dishes. So we have potatoes and we have the salmon dish, and we'll wait a few minutes for the other items to come out of the oven. While I'm waiting, I wanted to show you the lovage that we picked, and this I'm going to dry, and I just put a rubber band around it. I use a rubber band instead of a string because the rubber band tends to tighten up. As this dries, it shrinks. So if you use a string, it'll all fall out. So a rubber band works. I will use a Christmas tree hook and hook it to one of my dining room cupboards and let it hang there in a rather dark, airy place to dry. And then I'll crumble it up and put it into a jar and have it for my Thanksgiving stuffing or any other use I want to make of it. I can also use some of it fresh if I wish from the garden. If I make potato salad, I like to use it fresh. It gives a really nice flavor to the potato salad. Again, you use a small amount. You get a lot of flavor for just a small amount of sorrel. So hopefully you enjoy your herbs. If you have them, they add a lot to different dishes, and it's fun to experiment with them. There are a lot of different recipes in cookbooks. The library has a big selection of cookbooks that are fun to check out and use. Also online there are tons of recipes. All you have to do is type in sorrel or chives and you'll find so many of them. I also made some biscuits with chives, and these are cheddar cheese and chive biscuits. Basically, I made a regular biscuit recipe and added a handful of shredded cheddar cheese and a handful of chives. And they will be very good toasted. I could toast them and serve them with eggs for breakfast, or serve them with the meal for a dinner bread. Herbs can be added to so many different things, and we'll do a few more things as different herbs come into season on the show. Time to take our things out of the oven. I've roasted asparagus to go with our salmon dish, and for dessert, some warm baked pears. Some of the brown sugar and butter will go down into that wine that we put in the bottom and makes a nice little sauce. They're really nice served with a little yogurt, the creme fraiche, or even vanilla ice cream. I'm Liz Davey. You've been watching A Walk in the Garden on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable, and I hope you'll come and visit again another day.